Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. I attended the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings in person today, which is why I'm appearing in an undisclosed Halifax location today. And anyway, glad to give you this report. It was day 56 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings today. And like I say, I was there in person at the Harbourside Marriot in downtown Halifax. And there wasn't that many people there. I mean, it was a warm day here, beautiful late July day in Nova Scotia. There was probably about 25 people there in addition to the lawyers and the media who were present. Maybe 100 or so in total, Mass Casualty Commission staff as well. There were interesting choice, I guess, in a way, to put the senior Nova Scotia RCMP police officers on the witness stand here in late July, when I'd like to know what the numbers are for the live stream, if there were fewer people watching there, as there seemed to be fewer people attending today as well. So perhaps a choice on the part of the commission to do so. Learned a few things by being there in person. One is just talking to people about Superintendent Darren Campbell's apology yesterday. The people that were there in attendance certainly took it as a genuine expression on his part. And in fact, Ryan Farrington, one of the family members, said that afterwards, Superintendent Campbell spent 45 minutes with him, talking to him. I didn't ask him a lot about the conversation, but it was reflective of the apology and some degree of contrition. So really it made me think and made others think there, well, why wouldn't this have been done right away afterwards, and certainly would have saved lots of grief and heartache had the RCMP made that choice instead of waiting until 2+ years later. Of course, this isn't an apology on behalf of the RCMP. This was just Superintendent Campbell in his own personal capacity. Of course, he's a senior RCMP officer, but that doesn't count as an apology from the force itself. Interesting, I think this puts pressure on other senior RCMP officers to follow suit. We heard from Chris Leather today, and I'll talk about some of his testimony. He's going to be cross-examined tomorrow and is going to be followed up in August by Lee Bergerman and Brenda Lucky, the National Commissioner of the RCMP. So I think it'll be probably incumbent on them to follow the example of Darren Campbell or be criticized if they don't. So something to watch for. Another thing, just talking to some of the lawyers for the participants, certainly they're frustrated by the process, especially over the last month or so, where they've been really marginalized instead of being able to engage in cross-examination with the witnesses in a more fulsome manner as they would have liked. Although they did give some credit to the Mass Casualty Commission lawyers, saying that during these caucus meetings that they're having to discuss some of what's going to happen next, who's going to ask questions, that the Commission Council have been good to deal with. You know, if they don't like the answer they get, well, they have the option to go and say it to the commissioners themselves, or if they don't get any answers there, they can speak to the media as well. So there is some collegiality there, I guess I could say, or at least civility among the lawyers. Another thing, just a little thing I noticed, of the 100 people or so that were there, there were 3 people in total who were wearing masks for all or most of the day. Commissioner Stanton being one of them. Steve Topshee, one of the lawyers for Birch McDougall, the other, and the photographer being the third. So mask wearing really seems to be going by the wayside, at least within the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. So just a little point of interest. Now, Chris Leather was the second-ranking RCMP police officer in Nova Scotia at the time of the events of the mass casualty, and so he wasn't really involved in the operational decisions at the time, although he was involved in some of the communications issues. But really, he was called upon to talk about the press conferences and the communications, public communications after the fact that he led in some respects, or participated in some ways other. So the first discussion on that regard was just the question of holding a press conference in the first place. Who decides that? He says, well, there's no real science or clear policy on when to do so, but they rely on the communications. He called them corporate communications, which is an interesting way to think of the RCMP as a corporate entity. which it isn't really. So he reviewed some of the real mistakes, falsities, mischaracterizations, depending on how you consider each of these things that he did during the press conferences. Of course, people will remember in the earliest, the first one, he said there were at least 10 people killed, when I think the number known was either 17 or the fulsome number of 22 at the time. In the first press conference, he talked about how the police had, and this was in his statement, secured the perimeter. He said today that they were securing the perimeter. Would have been a better way to word that, but he did say secured. And then it was interesting, there was an email exchange that was shown to Chief Superintendent Leather today of a draft statement talking about the alert ready system, where the draft said that the RCMP had not considered using the emergency alert, whereas the actual statement said that they were in the process of drafting an alert when Wortman was captured and killed. So that's an interesting distinction. Really kind of feeds into some of what else they say about the emergency alert. In a later statement, actually in June, I'll jump ahead just because I'm talking about the emergency alert, when in the later, so they gave press conferences in April and then one later in June. In June, Chief Superintendent Leather noted that 29% of emergency alert calls, 911 calls that came after the emergency alert that was issued the week after the Portapique tragedy, the mass shootings, that 29% of these calls, there was an incident, I believe in Sackville, or misunderstanding, Sackville or Hammond's Plains, and an emergency alert was issued. Many people called 911. At the time, Chief Superintendent Leather said that 29% of the calls were missed, were not answered. So to suggest that all these people were calling for emergencies and never got through to 911. Actually, in fact, and this came out through Leah Scanlon's testimony as well, all of those calls, or the vast majority of them, people that didn't hang up, were either transferred to other call takers throughout the province, or were just not answered right away, but were answered, in 20 seconds later, 30 seconds later, or whenever the call was able to be processed. So all that, they weren't missed, they just weren't immediately processed. So that's a pretty significant misstatement, or whatever you want to call it, falsity on the part of Chief Superintendent Leather and the RCMP, certainly designed to undermine the alert ready system, and could only have been said with that aim in mind. The RCMP is certainly motivated to talk about the emergency alert system in a way that says, shows it that it wasn't effective, shouldn't have been used, wouldn't have made a difference. Well, I think the evidence now, the propensity of the evidence at least, says that it certainly would have made a huge difference. Jumping ahead a little bit about the alert ready again, in his advice or his thoughts on it, Chief Superintendent Leather was still talking about the care that should go into crafting a message, an emergency alert message. And again, I think the process they're advocating really seems too slow. Just compare that to the very basic information. There was an emergency alert issued in BC within the last week. Basic information, Caucasian male wearing this, dangerous to approach. That's all you need to say. Just get that information out, correct it if need be, and then indicate when the emergency is over. So that's the advice from the experts on emergency alerting, and that's not what was done in Nova Scotia. Other mistakes, falsities in the press conferences, there was the information on the vehicle, the mock police cruiser. In the press conference, Chief Superintendent Leather says that it was immediately tweeted by communication staff, when in fact it was actually 3 hours later, after the photos, the information was received, that the information was tweeted out by the RCMP. So today, Chief Superintendent Leather says, well, that was a poor word choice. Well, it's more than that. It's misleading, and goes to, it's misleading in terms of the RCMP's performance at the time. Makes it sound like, things were happening quickly and immediately, when in fact things took 3 hours. Jumping ahead again to the June press conference, there was a decision made by the RCMP not to disclose, even though they knew about it, this Criminal Intelligence Service bulletin talking about how Wortman had, back in 2011, made a threat to, he wanted to kill a police officer. That was in Criminal Intelligence Bulletin, which is shared among the police agencies in Nova Scotia. And, why withhold the existence of the bulletin from the public? The question was asked in a way that's like, well, wasn't that just to, again, support the public relations element of the RCMP's position? Chris Leather denied that, said it was, it wasn't just to avoid tough questions on it. They were trying to find out more about it and talk to the other agencies beforehand. It didn't seem all that persuasive to me. I'm not sure what others thought of that explanation, but certainly seemed, again, like they were just trying to protect the RCMP brand by not providing that information to the public at that time when they knew it. So that's that section. Now, talking about, Chris Leather was talking about suggestions and all these things, and he talked about training for press conferences and how these senior officers should get more training. I'd suggest maybe the opposite. Actually, I think less training, because the training seems really designed to give them the means to not reveal information, but do it in a way that seems like they're being forthcoming and being helpful to the public. So that seems to be what the training would amount to. I would say that the argument would be get more junior officers who are closer to the scene, that actually were involved in the investigation, to give press conferences with very little training and just answer the questions. How about that? Instead of trying to take the information and conceal it in a more stylistic, professional way. So that would be an alternate thought to that of Chief Superintendent Leather. He was asked, so that was sort of the discussion about the press conferences, some of the highlights of that. He was also asked about staffing levels, because he's engaged in that. For example, in Colchester County, they were paying for 6 officers, but only had 4 at any time. The province was we were paying for 6, but not getting that. So he was asked a little bit about that, advocating for bigger budgets, despite not actually commit or fulfilling the contract as written. An interesting moment early in the afternoon when Chief Superintendent Leather was asked about a phone call that he had with Commissioner Brenda Luckie, where she was asking him to provide her with a list of the firearms. So this has become a controversial question. And Chief Superintendent Leather just said, well, I don't want to answer that question. And the lawyer, Rachel Young from the Mass Casualty Commission, just sort of moved on. All right, well, I'll ask the next question then if you don't want to answer that. He said he wanted to get legal advice before he answered it. Now, the federal DOJ lawyers were there, didn't stand up and object to the question, but anyway, I suspect we'll see more of that tomorrow in the cross-examination of Chief Superintendent Leather by the participants. All very interesting. By the way, I noticed today, just following along the news, that the RCMP out in BC, there was a bank robbery in Saanich, BC, with about a month ago, I think now, and so the RCMP are being asked what guns were used. The same sort of questions were being asked here. And again, out there, they are saying, nope, we're not revealing that information, and giving very sort of vague explanations, justifications in their mind as to why they're not doing so. So it doesn't seem like, nationally at least, that they've learned that lesson or changed that approach. There was lots of questions given to Chief Superintendent Leather in his role as sort of second in command in Nova Scotia about service levels, interoperability with municipal services, shared services like the Criminal Intelligence Service. Kind of, the thrust of it, to me at least, sort of suggested, well, we should be looking at a more integrated, singular police model in Nova Scotia if, all these efforts at integrating the patchwork of services as it currently stands aren't working. Now, Chief Superintendent Leather had a separate sort of take on that. Rather than removing the RCMP and working on all these things, he said the problems are really personal problems among the higher level officers, the chiefs of the municipal forces, the senior RCMP officers, And now we all know that all of the, the staff sergeants that we've heard from have all retired. Lee Bergerman has retired. Darren Campbell has been promoted and moved on. Chief Superintendent Leather has been promoted and moved on to New Brunswick. So all of those senior RCMP that have retired or moved on are done. And so that the baggage that came with them that affected the relationships with the other municipal forces, that's also gone with them. And so everybody can kind of go on as they are with fresh blood and, continue with the current structure. Well, not sure about that. I think there's a deeper brand issue with the RCMP as a result of all of this. And so we'll see if, but anyway, it was a valiant effort on the part of Chief Superintendent Leather to support the RCMP's continued presence in Nova Scotia. All right, so that was that for today. I just want to leave you with another thought. And I was watching Monday the Chief Superintendent Leather, Commissioner Lucky, former Assistant Commissioner Bergerman in Ottawa giving testimony to the Parliamentary Committee. Darren Campbell, Chief Superintendent now Darren Campbell, Monday and Tuesday on the stand here. And all these senior officers are sort of pointing fingers at one another. No, that wasn't my responsibility. That was in their realm, their responsibility, not me. And really a lot of mutual finger pointing going on among these senior officers. So it led me to think this. If there was a conspiracy agreement among the senior officials in the RCMP to conceal certain information, particularly I'm thinking about, the potential that there was a relationship between Gabriel Wortman and the RCMP as of an informant or an agent or whatever, that if there was such a conspiracy, that these senior officers wouldn't be pointing fingers at one another, but they would be sort of going above and beyond to try to look like they were supporting one another and working as a team. Yes, they did a great job. They did a great job. Everybody did a great job. And, just sort of batten down the hatches kind of approach. But instead, we're seeing this territorially motivated finger pointing among all the senior officers, trying to preserve their own careers, their own reputations, to an extent trying to preserve the RCMP's reputation, but pointing to other officers as it was their responsibility and all those things. So that kind of flies in the face, I think, to me at least, of a widespread at the senior level conspiracy. Now, that's not to say that there weren't operators at a lower level that were dealing with Wortman, but the information, if that was the case, wouldn't seem to have reached the senior level. So just a thought, a theory I'm working through. I'd be happy to hear thoughts that others have on that notion. And that's something, we'll see where it goes. We'll see what happens with cross-examination of Chris Leather tomorrow with the testimony of Lee Bergerman, which I mentioned in my blog was Friday. I think that might have been an original or early draft of the schedule. It's actually in August. So we'll come back for that after the end of tomorrow. There'll be a break for, I think, 3 weeks before further proceedings. Anyway, that's it for everything today. Day 56 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.